Hello, good evening. I'm Susan Engel. I direct talks and educational programming at New York's 92nd Street Y, one of the city's premier cultural and community centers. We are so delighted you are with us for tonight's very important discussion. As a growing chorus takes to the streets to urgently demand racial and economic justice across the country, Stacey Abrams' passionate and clear-eyed New York Times op-ed last week argued that voting remains a crucial tool in achieving these goals. Ms. Abrams has been fighting for fair elections for years, and her arguments are now more relevant than ever. This past Tuesday, she published her new book, which is also the topic of our discussion tonight, entitled Our Time is Now: Power, Purpose, and the Fight for a Fair America, in which the celebrated national leader offers a blueprint to end voter suppression, empower citizens, and take back our country. I urge you to purchase a copy of her book by following the link on this page that's posted on your YouTube page from the bookstore, A Room of One's Own. We are truly honored to welcome Ms. Abrams to our virtual stage today. Joining her in conversation is New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Senator Gillibrand is a champion for the economic empowerment of women and working families, and she has authored new legislation to rewrite the rules of the workplace so it can keep up with our changing workforce. She is fighting to pass bills that would raise the minimum wage, make quality childcare more affordable, create universal pre-K, and ensure equal pay for equal work. Senator Gillibrand also introduced the Family Act, which will create a national paid leave program for all American workers. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Well, are you supposed to talk first or shall I?
I think you get to go first.
Okay. So good evening, everybody. It is a delight to welcome Stacey Abrams to the 92nd Street Y. It is the best place to do a book event. I did my book events there, and I think it's just such an amazing community. I'm so grateful that you all can participate in this setting. I know it's not ideal. People would love to be in person, to get to meet Stacey in person and talk to her face to face, but this is as close as we can get. As everyone knows, our city's been hit hard, but these are the kinds of community events that we can do and be able to have that time together. I just finished Stacey's book today. I think it's fantastic. Stacey Abrams, Our Time is Now. And the book is brilliant. It takes us through everything you need to know about elections, everything you need to know about her election, how she got where she got. She talked about all the injustices that she saw in voting rights in Georgia, but also injustices across the country and globally. She is somebody who thinks deeply about policy and about how to take our country forward. And she really lays out plans and ideas and a vision for the future in this book that is really inspiring. And I know you're all going to want to read it if you haven't read it yet. I love the way she describes her book. On page 10, she says that her book is, quote, a story that is one part danger, one part action, and all true. And it's a story about how and why we fight for our democracy and win. I think that's a story that all of us need to hear right now. So I'd love to just dive right in. This book is about us and her. It's about what we should be doing in a time such as this, in a moment such as this. And she says, quote, this is on page 119, citizenship requires constant action, which includes voting, protesting, and participating. And without the combination, we are all in jeopardy. And I want to talk to you about all three of those areas tonight. So first, I'd love to start our conversation on this notion of protests, because we are in this moment right now where our country is raw. and people are marching, they are screaming, they are speaking out as loudly as they can, and they're demanding action. And it is such a powerful moment for our nation and for everyone who has something at stake. And so I'd love you to talk a little bit about how important this moment is. I've been so inspired by Black Lives Matter and what they've done. I've been heartbroken as we watched George Floyd lose his life. But this is not new, and it's something we've seen for generations. And I'd really like to hear from you how you see this. I love the fact that you started your book with a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer, quoting, "We will stay and stand up for what belongs to us as American citizens because they can't say that we haven't had patience." So you talk about voting rights movements, LGBT movements, women's rights movements in your book. I'd love to hear what you think about this moment and what change you hope to see because of it.
Thank you. First of all, Senator, thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this conversation. Thank you to Susan Engel and to the 92nd Street Y. They were kind enough to have me here a few years ago for my first book, Lead from the Outside, my first nonfiction work. And it is just an honor to be back here again, and certainly to be here with all of you who are watching and listening. I think about the protest in light of my first big protest. My parents used to take us to advocate and to agitate. They would have us go and volunteer, but they also would take us to participate in acts of civic engagement, of protest. But as a young adult, as an 18-year-old at Spelman College, my freshman year, second semester, near the end of finals, was the day of the Rodney King decision. And for younger folks, it's important to understand that was the first time that there had been a video of police brutality in the modern sort of post-civil rights era. This videotape of this man being beaten by cops in Los Angeles had really sparked the rage and the outrage about police brutality. But in April of 1992, a jury returned not guilty verdicts against every single one of those officers who'd been caught on tape taking this action. I led, with a number of colleagues, we led a march from the campuses to the city hall and back with no issues. But the next day, the anger and the despair was roiling, especially across the street in the housing projects that were next door to our campuses. There has long been this town gown challenge of, the folks who could afford to go to Spelman or Morehouse or Clark or Morris Brown and the young people who lived in those housing developments. But what happened on that day when the protest started, they cordoned off the entire area and they tear gassed us all because there was no difference in the minds of those in charge. There's no difference of economics, of education. They just saw Black people who were acting up and they were going to stop it from happening. And that happened in a city that was being led by a Black mayor. And so I put all this into context because that was my first experience, not simply of being in protest, but being assaulted by the government that was supposed to allow that type of protest to happen. And there were arguments about whether it was destruction of property and it was violent. And putting all of that into context, you have to think about the lives lived by people who could watch someone who looked like them, who looked like me, be beaten and to be told justice would not be served. If you fast forward 30 years to where we are today, that is what we've seen. Only unlike the singular example that we had with Rodney King, this generation has seen these videos daily, constantly. They run on loops on YouTube and other platforms. And we can list the names of George Floyd, but we can also list Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered in the streets of Georgia, and the people who killed him, who murdered him in broad daylight, were set free for 74 days, told to go home. Breonna Taylor, who was murdered. But we know the litany of names is so long. And so the protest we're seeing right now, the context of this moment is that the demonstrations are necessary because we should not be allowed to forget again. And not forget that the brutality happens, not forget the extrajudicial killings, but we should not be allowed to forget that we have to continue to demand change. Because in the aftermath of the Rodney King protest, There was no dramatic action taken in a presidential election. That was the year of a presidential election. There were no demands for national changes to how police officers were going to be adjudicated. Unlike the bill that you have sponsored in the Senate that Representative Jeffries offered in the House, the Eric Garner Excessive Force Prevention Act, like that didn't happen in a visible and sustained way. And the reason that matters, the reason these protests matter, is that we cannot be allowed to forget why we're angry. And it's not that the memory will recede, but what would recede is the belief that we deserve change. And that's what I think is pushing people into the streets night after night for more than 2 weeks. It's that sense of ownership over our democracy that says that we should not have to withstand another 30 years of inaction in order to become fully humanized in the life of our country.
I think that's so profound, what you said, Stacey. The thing that I found so interesting about your analysis in your book, because you address this for readers who, because you didn't write it in this moment, you wrote it before this moment, but it's so applicable. So I think it's chapter 5, taking our power back. You say here, I believe the most important job of a citizen advocate is to first educate leaders about what you want and why you want it. And then you say they might not agree with your solution, but you have to educate them first. And then you say the second job is to activate others to help you press leaders to adopt rules to make it happen. And then you go into a lot of examples and a lot of good advice for people who maybe don't know what to do at this moment and don't know how to make it be most effective. You said, while it can sound daunting, all this really means is finding friends and allies who share your concerns and are willing to help to gather even more allies. Educate and activation have taken your issue as far as you can. The final step is to agitate, which is, I see your favorite part, which is to agitate the powers that be. Bring pressure to bear until doing what you want is easier than resisting or opposing you. Use social media, traditional outreach, good old-fashioned protests, raise awareness, push for action. Groups like Indivisible will train you. You name a bunch of action groups like Planned Parenthood, NARAL, Moms Demand Action, just to name a few, and NAACP. And you say that agitation's your favorite part. I feel like this is a moment where agitation is what's needed, and it's needed to be done as loudly and as aggressively and as continuously as possible, because as you know, you said so effectively in the book, these are not new problems. They've been here for centuries. And the truth is that a lot of white America is finally waking up to the realities of Black America. And I think many people have never bothered to even think about the differences and how hard and difficult it is for so many people just to exercise their right to vote, just to get a good education, just to get a decent paying job, just to not be, brutalized by the police. That is the reality for too many Americans. And I think for a lot of people, particularly for white women and peers of mine that I've talked to throughout my communities, they're just opening their eyes. And it's shocking that it's taken this long and this much horror to do that. But this moment is real. And so taking advantage of it to not only educate, as you say, peers, create allies, and push for action. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how do we be good allies, and how do you educate more people to understand that this is a moment for everyone to rise up, and should not be the burden of Black and brown people to do this alone. That women, white women of privilege, any person who is not engaged should be actually protesting too.
I begin with the common thread that ties us all together, which is we're Americans. And that entitles us to full citizenship if we are citizens, but it entitles us to full protection if we're here. And I want us to be very clear that while the core of this narrative, the core of this challenge begins with Black lives, it begins with the dehumanization embedded in our Constitution's original writing. We cannot ignore that this is festered and has become a part of a narrative for other communities. Mm-hmm. It's completely wrapped into how we either think about, or worse, don't think about what's happening to the Native American communities.
Right.
In fact, the Navajo community that stretches across 3 states was completely dismissed from the COVID response. And it took a governor pleading for support in order to start helping those that she serves.
Right.
Then we have to think about what happens to Latino families who face similar challenges, not identical, and let's never try to diminish the legitimacy of the rage and pain of African Americans, of Black folks. But we have to expand our understanding that if you are a person of color, as you said, if you are Black or brown, that these are things that you confront every single day. And while there has been both complicity and ignorance on the part of some in the white community, what we face is also a sense of inevitability. There is this moment where we just presume it's not going to change. And we don't seek allyship because we don't know that it will ever arrive. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book was that I don't think that's how it has to be. I saw in the campaign that I was able to run in 2018 that we were able to build allies and build relationships and change narratives in ways we were never expected to do in the Deep South.
Yep.
And that meant not only that we tripled Latino participation for Democrats and tripled Asian Pacific Islander participation, we increased youth participation by 139%. We increased Black participation in Georgia by 40%, but we also increased white participation. Yeah. We got white people to understand that our futures are yoked together, our successes are yoked together. And if you want more for you, you've got to bring us along, or more importantly, you've got to follow us there. And so I think one of the responsibilities of allyship is acknowledging not just privilege, but acknowledging the biases that are built into our everyday behaviors. It's acknowledging the legitimacy of the coworker who complains to you and says that race may be a part of it. Instead of reflexively dismissing it, it's sitting still and listening. Because even if you can't prove it, she or he feels it, and you have the responsibility of friendship and allyship to hear it. Because typically the rejection of it is because we don't want to admit it could happen. And so we reject the experience out of hand. It's about acknowledging the implicit biases that we have when we see someone getting on the elevator or walking past you on a street corner. But it's also the explicit bias that we often bring into the decisions that we make. Those are concrete things that can be done. But what's even more vital is that when you hold power, use it.
Yes.
The reason I write about this is because we have
you do. So you were an agitator and you went from outsider into office holder. And how do we get more agitators like you to run for office?
One, we have to make it seem worth it. Part of the challenge with getting people to vote, voter suppression, I spend half the book talking about the intricacy of voter suppression because we need to understand where it began and how it manifests itself today. Because we get tricked into thinking it's gone because it doesn't look like it did in Eyes on the Prize. But the reality is, if you watched the elections in Georgia, if you watched people being forced into lines in the heart of COVID's first explosion in April, what happened in Wisconsin, then we have to know that voter suppression is real. If you remember the 8-hour lines in Texas, 7-hour lines in the primaries, these are all examples of voter suppression. But the second part is, when protesters stand in the streets, when they demand action and they are chided, they are chastised, well, just go vote. Those are not going to be responsible answers, in part because people don't trust that voting is going to make change. And the opportunity instead of saying just go vote, it's having an authentic conversation about how long it takes to make change. We disembody power. We tend to talk about it as structures, as this amorphous thing that exists out there organizing and manipulating our lives, but that it's not concrete. Power is people. Yeah. Power is nothing more than the people who are elected to office, who support those elected to office, those who finance those elected to office. And the power changes when the people who get into office actually look like the problems they're trying to solve. And so one reason running for office became so important to me was that I didn't see as many people as I needed to who shared my background, right? Who were working poor with parents who did everything they could and still suffered and still had to struggle, who has a sister who's a judge and a brother who's been a convict. I needed to be in office because I needed to be there to speak about both of them. Right. And so one of the ways we get people to take their power is to understand that we can be the ones who change who the people are. But changing the players in the game doesn't necessarily mean the game gets better. But if we don't change the players, we are guaranteed to keep the terrible actions that happen today.
I think that's right. So,
Hi, Mike.
hi. I think you guys should be on mute.
Make sure you are on mute.
Yeah, there's some folks
So
who
you have a
are
microphone
chatting.
lower bottom, left or right hand corner.
It's okay.
And grab weights. So this is an equipment class. So if you have them, go ahead and grab the weights.
This is, hold on. There's a, hold on.
Hold on or iPad, whatever you have. You can also do bottled water. You can also
Hold on.
do
I figured it out. It was an exercise class on my iPad.
Look,
I was like, that sounds like Mike, the Pilates instructor. That's who it was. Okay, back to our discussion. So in a state that people often write off as deep, deep red, you set voter turnout records by appealing to an entirely new majority. And you referenced it a little bit in your earlier answer. You didn't exclude white folks and you didn't exclude Black folks. You actually went to every neighborhood, to red and purple areas that tend Republican, but also you didn't take for granted or dismiss voters that are often not likely to vote. You made a point of going into every community to make sure that people knew you wanted their vote and you wanted to hear their concerns. And I thought that was such a validation of being the governor for everyone, being able to serve everyone, being, knocking on every door, just not the ones that people tell you to knock on. And I thought that was really, really profound. How did you do that? And what should candidates running in red and purple states and districts learn from your successes?
so we did it by believing from the beginning that the current narrative in politics is wrong. So there's this idea that you have persuasion voters, swing voters, and then base voters. So base voters will do whatever you need. And so you should concentrate all of your attention on those who are the least likely, who vote in every election, but who vacillate on which side of the aisle they're going to vote. The problem with that is that when you take any community for granted, they're going to notice and their participation is going to drop off. And so while you're catering to a group that has demonstrated to you there is no real allegiance to your belief system, you are ignoring and alienating those who actually do share your beliefs, but need to be motivated to do something about it. And so often in campaigns, people make a choice. There are campaigns that choose only to go after the base and ignore and write off everyone else. Then there are campaigns that focus so myopically on everyone else that the messaging they send tells everyone who's not in that group that they're really not that relevant. I believe that you have to campaign to everyone and let people tell you no. I didn't tell myself no. So I campaigned in rural Georgia and rural Black Georgia, but I also campaigned where they filmed Deliverance. Mm-hmm. I went everywhere. I went to synagogues. I went to mosques. I went to taquerias. I went to soul food restaurants. I went to temples. I went everywhere and talked to everyone. But more importantly, I listened in all of these places. One of the challenges for politicians in this moment is that we're still running the campaigns of 20 years ago, not recognizing that the demographic changes have also changed expectations and it's changed opportunities. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be given credit for being a singular example of a candidate who can pull this off in the Deep South. I did it in the Deep South, which is proof they can be done anywhere. Right. That if in the Deep South, we can transform the electorate in such a fashion that we come within 54,000 votes of actual success. And that is in the face of the kind of grotesque voter suppression that people who may have thought I was exaggerating saw in real time on Tuesday. That we know that it's possible, but we have to invest. We have to have those conversations, and we have to treat those voters with the respect of authenticity. One thing that when you came down to visit when I was running, one of the reasons I was so excited to have you is that you are known for your authenticity, your candor. You say what you're thinking and you stand in your space. And what candidates want to see, what constituents want to see and what candidates too often don't provide is the honesty of a campaign. I would tell folks, I want to expand Medicaid in Georgia. We're one of 14 states where you can't get access to healthcare if you're poor. Mm-hmm. But I didn't promise them I could do it on my own. I had talked to them about, here's how I can do it, because I've been able to do things with Republicans. I've been able to negotiate and get things done, not because I compromised my values, but because I amplified their needs. My favorite example is that I was able to block anti-environmental legislation by working with the Tea Party. They agreed that climate change was real, but they believed property values were real. And I convinced them that the stream buffer erosion would have diminished their property values. Yeah. So this notion that we have too often, particularly as progressive candidates, that we have to be so pure and so regimented that we only talk to those who already agree with us, ignores the reality that you serve everyone when you're elected, but you serve them from your core of integrity and your core of authenticity. But you cannot do that if you ignore people and refuse to engage them and give them a chance to tell you who they are and what they need.
Yeah, well, you're quite right. One thing I thought that was so interesting, and I knew this from the news, but I didn't quite understand it till I read the book. You decided not to concede in 2018, and you write that, quote, "We've been taught to expect concession not only to the outcome of an electoral contest, but to the system that undergirds it." So you did not concede and you did not stop fighting. In fact, you decided to make your fight even bigger, and you addressed issues with voting, the census, and gerrymandering. But let's start with the voting. As someone who grew up learning about politics from my grandmother at her knee in upstate New York in campaign headquarters, you wrote about the influence of your grandparents, and you said that, quote, "Neither of your grandparents had unexpressed opinions," which is a lovely thing to say. I could definitely say that about my grandmother. But then we saw that your grandmother was afraid to go vote for the first time, even though she knew how hard won that ability was. You also talk about a friend of your sister's who was so frustrated by the hurdles to voting that she said she would never vote again. It was in the introduction. How do we counteract that fear and frustration that even the boldest and bravest voters we know have? Now, especially in this era of COVID, we saw people go to the polls in Wisconsin and stayed even though they knew they might get sick. And we're trying to assure that we can have vote by mail in all 50 states, but some governors might not accommodate it. And so people may have to make that horrible decision. Do I want to vote even if I could be vulnerable to COVID?
I began the book with the story of my grandmother because she's emblematic of a decision so many of us make without thinking about it. She knew that voting had been made legal, but something being legal doesn't mean it's actually available. Mm-hmm. And as much as she was afraid of voting, what she was deeply afraid of was being wrong that the country had changed enough that her voice would matter, being wrong that the work that had been done, that the Voting Rights Act wasn't real, being wrong that a law making her fully a citizen for the first time was actually going to be sustainable. And unfortunately, she was correct because of the Supreme Court's evisceration of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. We know that her fear was real. It just took 40 years for it to come to fruition. But what when juxtaposed against my sister's friend, what they both reveal is that hope hurts. Hope is hard. Yeah. It is hard to believe that if you take an action that the good will come. It is easier to just say the bad is already here. As long as you've accepted the bad, you know how to navigate it. But hope requires that you put yourself out there and that you expect more. Right. But part of what I want people to understand, especially in the midst of COVID-19, what we saw play out in Wisconsin, fair fight was on the ground there. We were working there to make certain that people had the information and the opportunity to go and cast those votes. We wanted them to be able to do so through mail, but we knew that there was going to be a likelihood that they would have to go in person. That's what happened in Georgia just on Tuesday. Because let's be clear, COVID isn't gone. Georgia still has an incidence rate, has a 7-day rolling average that is identical. In fact, it's higher right now than it was when the governor finally declared shelter in place. So
Right.
COVID isn't gone. We just have gotten used to it because we've gotten used to bad. We've gotten used to thousands of deaths. We're now at above 110,000 people dead in our country from a disease that could be prevented if more people stayed inside. And so we get used to the bad because the hope of good is just sometimes too painful. But what I want people to understand, the reason I was so excited about the opportunity to write the book is that our time is now, because this is the moment where we have this confluence of not just the existence of voter suppression, but groups that are fighting back. You've got Mark Elias, who's filing lawsuit after lawsuit, the Lawyers Committee, the Leadership Conference. You've got the NAACP, you've got the Brennan Center, you've got the ACLU. We have a coterie of organizations that are working hard to make your rights real.
Right.
The way we lose those rights is if we concede them to those who would steal them from us.
Right.
But the corollary is that we also have to have people who explain that voting does not create instant gratification.
Right.
You and I both know this. Sometimes it's going to take years. Sometimes it takes decades, because we're trying to dismantle a system that is working exactly the way it was designed.
Yes.
This is not an aberration. This isn't a bug. This is the feature.
Yep.
And so everything we do is going to be pushing against what has been not only built, but solidified and fortified and hardened over 240 plus years.
Yep.
It's going to take us time, but my excitement, my enthusiasm, my hope, the reason my grandmother finally voted, the reason that young woman, I hope, believed it was worth voting this week, is that the reality is they only win if we give up.
Right.
If we keep pushing back, we will win, because I can count.
Yeah.
There are more of us than there are of them. And the more of us who believe that, the better our lives will become.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you revealed quite effectively was all the ways, all the tactics that Republicans in your state have used to suppress votes. Very pernicious, very unethical, illegal, and horrible. You talked a little bit about the Shelby v. Holder decision undoing the Protections of Voting Rights Act. And you even told the story of how you had trouble voting when you were running for governor, which is outrageous. Like, you're like, I would remember if I did an absentee ballot. I mean, that's just some level of absolute terrible. So that was pretty remarkable that you kept your cool. I would not have. So you really know the rules inside and out. What are some of the tactics that people should be watching for in the next election? What should they look for? And second, what can voters do to educate themselves before going to the polls or filling out a ballot?
Sure. So first of all, what happened in Georgia is grotesque and well documented, but it is not the only example. Part of the reason I wanted to write the book was that people focused on the election in Georgia, my election in Georgia, which exempted Texas and Florida and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Kansas and North Dakota from, and I can't list all of the states. It exempted so many others from their bad actions because of what happened here. And so part of what I describe is that voter suppression has three facets. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast your ballot? And does your ballot get counted? And so underneath each of those are different examples. In Georgia, it was the issue of exact match, this deeply racially discriminatory system that held your registration hostage if there was a typographical error, not made by you, but made by some bureaucrat entering your information. You were never told what the problem was. You were just told you didn't get registered. And for people who don't understand the system, they were told, thousands of them, 53,000 people were held hostage by the system, 80% of whom were people of color, 70% of whom were African-American. But if you go to Tennessee, where they had a great registration drive in 2018, Tennessee passed a law saying that third-party groups can't register without facing criminal charges if they don't follow all these very very complicated rules, because people of color are twice as likely to register to vote if a third party asks them. So can you register and can you stay on the rolls? Ohio just had a major purge. More than 17 million people have been purged from the rolls between 2016 and 2018. That's not all dead people. That includes a lot of people who still have the right to vote, but lost it because they chose not to vote in an election.
Right.
Then it's, can you cast a ballot? I use Wisconsin, restrictive voter IDs. Restrictive voter IDs is not the same as not having identification.
Mm-hmm.
Every state requires some form of proof that you are who you are. What's happened in the last 20 years is that the proof has become narrower and narrower, and they've made it harder and harder to get it. So in Wisconsin in 2016, a 100-year-old Black woman born into segregation was disallowed from voting because she couldn't produce an original birth certificate. That's because if you were in the segregated South, if you were born in a segregated state, Black people often weren't allowed to be born in hospitals, which is how you get a birth certificate.
Right.
And even though she could produce the census, which is restricted for 72 years, she could prove a census that had her name in it. That wasn't sufficient for them to allow her to vote, even though she'd been voting in that state for decades. And the third is, can your ballot be counted? And ballot counting is an issue. I usually just offhandedly refer to that as Florida. But in every state, there is some iteration of this. There are some good states that have done their best to mitigate the harm, but the bad states, the states that are the most egregious when it comes to voter suppression, use these three tools. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot, and does your ballot get counted? And so I spend a lot of time in the book laying it out and giving you examples of each state and what happens. But here's the antidote. Number one, go to vote.org. It can tell you what's happening in your state, what you need to know to vote. But you can also reach out to fairfight2020.com. We are working in 18 battleground states to not only identify what suppression looks like, but help people get access to the resources they need to vote. And so between fairfight2020.org and vote.org, you can get good information. But the bottom line is, we know who we can trust. And if we don't know, we can do the research. Sometimes that research is doing it yourself. Sometimes it's talking to someone you trust. But most of all, it's looking at what they've done. And if they've been there long enough that not that they haven't tried. If they've tried, give them more time. But if they've not tried, if they've given you excuse after excuse for why they haven't even bothered, that's a reason to replace them with someone who's willing to at least try.
So that's very helpful. One of the tactics that they're desperately trying to use is to not let us vote by mail. And I'm working really hard to protect the post office because I want it to survive past summer and it's about to run out of money. So we have a couple of ideas how to do this, to give it money, to make sure it doesn't have to prepay its all its liabilities, and to have postal banking, which is another big idea. But it generates about $9 billion for the post office, in addition to providing basic banking to the 30% of Americans who are unbanked or underbanked. Mm-hmm. So it helps in a lot of ways. But so what changes do you think we will need to make for this election in particular if the Republicans try to demand people to vote with COVID in person? And what do you suggest we should do between now and election to try to make sure that doesn't happen?
So there are 34 states that allow vote by mail with no excuses. So if you're in one of those 34 states, as soon as you're eligible, apply for your absentee ballot. Do it on the first day so that in case it doesn't show up, you've got time to fix it. Right. So that's number one. Of the 16 states that require an excuse, we are working through litigation and other methods to try to expand their understanding of what constitutes an emergency. Possibly contracting a fatal disease should be sufficient as an excuse not to go and vote in person. And unfortunately, it didn't work in a few states. And so there are about 4 states that are being completely intractable. And again, there are a total of 16 states that have some degree of restriction. We also have 9 states that require that, or 10 states that require that you either have to have a witness to your ballot or a notary public. If you can find a notary right now, congratulations to you. Most people can't find it. And so we're working in coalition with a number of organizations to try to remove the onerous requirements that are being put in place. But the best solution, Senator, is the one that you and others have been working with, which is to pass the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act invests in states so they can scale up vote by mail. It mandates the guardrails. It says that because of COVID-19, because we're in a pandemic, this is not a permanent change. It says because we're in a pandemic, that is a reasonable excuse for any person to not have to go to the polls. And it makes it safer for those who have to go. Because what we have to remember is that if you're disabled, if you have a language barrier, if you are displaced, if you are homeless, if you tried to vote by mail and it didn't work, you may have to show up. So we want to get as many people out of line as possible so those who have to be there in person can do so safely. I was actually part of the problem on Tuesday. I tried to vote early. I tried to vote by mail. My mail-in ballot arrived. I filled it out. And when I got ready to put it in the return envelope, it was sealed shut. I tried to steam it open, didn't work. I blame Perry Mason for giving me false hope. And I had to go and vote in person. There were disabled people in those lines. There were people who had no choice but to be there. I shouldn't have been there because if I had not been there, the line would have been shorter. And I know it's just one person, but every person we can get out of line makes it safer for those who have to be in line. And that's why we should be demanding the HEROES Act, which also includes money for the post office. And I'm going to add a little plug to what you're working on. One of the reasons, and this is something I talk about, not particularly in the book directly, but it's a part of the larger narrative. I don't believe in voting simply for the act. I believe in voting for the consequences. We need change. We need things to be better. We need to dismantle systemic racism and systemic injustice. We need to build new systems that actually reflect the values that we have in a diverse society. Banking is one of them. We know of millions of Americans who did not receive their stimulus checks because they receive EBT. They are often unbanked and they don't file taxes. If they could go to the post office as a bank, they would have been able to get those dollars, that $1,200 that would be transformative for their lives. But because of the banking structure we have, because of the racist and classist systems that we have set up in this country, they were denied one of the reliefs, one of the few reliefs being offered. And so we have to stop disconnecting the act of voting from the action
that we're trying to get done.
The policies we're trying to get done. That's what energizes me. And that's why I'm pushing so hard for the HEROES Act, for the investment, for the rules, but also for the opportunity for more people to be heard in November.
So I'm going to ask one more question because then we want to get to audience questions. I want to talk a little bit about the census because you spent a chapter on the census. And what are you addressing, or how are you addressing the effects of COVID-19 on the census? And is it changing how or what you're doing to fight for fair redistricting?
So I begin the conversation about the census by talking about how it's been weaponized by the GOP.
Yeah.
And let's be clear. The census is how we tell ourselves the story of who we are, but it's also a predictor of who we're going to be. And right now we're the most diverse nation we have ever been. And we're not going to become less diverse in the next decade. And so if we are going to be diverse, the only opportunity for those who benefit from the monochromatic vision they have of America is to hide the people who look different, to not only hide them from the story, but to erase their economic power and their political power. Right. And that's what Thomas Hofeller, on behalf of the Republican Party, did. It's what he did
very willfully and very purposefully.
And wrote it all down.
And he wrote it down. I mean, it's all strategic. They spend a ton of money doing this kind of stuff, and it's all to change outcomes so that they can have elected leaders who give them tax breaks and help the wealthy and don't do all the things that we'd like done.
Right. And the corollary is if you were a poor person, if you're a person of color who lives in the United States in an area where COVID-19 has ravaged communities, you are less likely to have access to the PPE that you need. There are hospitals to serve you. We
saw what happened with the small businesses that had the biggest connections got the first checks.
Exactly.
The first, $100 billion. Like, it was not a small amount of money.
And 90% of Black businesses did not get a dime. That first wave. And so all of that is tied with the census. We think that it just happens. No, it's scientific. There is data collected from the census that goes into algorithms that determines the allocation of resources, $1.5 trillion per year and climbing.
Yeah.
When the census does not count communities of color, when it doesn't count immigrants, when it doesn't count children, when it doesn't count rural communities, then those monies never arrive. But the reality is those monies don't disappear. They get reallocated to people who already have enough, and they get more. Yeah. And then the political power is the other piece of it. It's how we reapportion every congressional seat. As you know, 435 seats, States that get bigger get more power. States that lose seats lose power.
Mhm.
But because we know a lot of the demographic changes that are happening are increasing the population of states, but with people of color,
Yep.
the goal is to make sure they don't get counted, so then they don't have the political power that would come to those communities in those states because they live there. If we participate in the census, Fair Count, the organization I created, is designed to make sure that people of color, that those who are hardest to count, get counted. And while we didn't plan for a pandemic, we did plan for a catastrophe. We just didn't know it would be this one. And so what we did is that we shifted from having field organizers knocking on doors to have field organizers who are calling on phones and sending texts.
Perfect.
And we're doing our best to shift the reality, but we cannot lose sight of the goal, which is that we need every person to be counted. Because if you want to see and you know this better than anyone, if we want to see a collapsed recovery before it begins, let the same people be in charge. And worse, if we do not participate, the gerrymandering that we saw in 2010 is going to be worse than anything we've ever seen, because we're not just running the 2016 election again. We're running the 2010 election when we lost the House and we lost a decade of progress. That's why the census matters, and that's why we've got to focus.
Well said. Okay, let's go to some audience questions. Jordana W. asks, what's the path to fair redistricting in Georgia, and how can we help?
The only path we have to fair redistricting in Georgia is twofold. One, we have to have an accurate census, because if communities of color are not counted by law, they cannot be considered for the purposes of drawing those lines, which is why they don't want you to get counted. Because it's illegal to gerrymander based on race. It's legal to do it based on party. And so
which is absurd. Like, how the Supreme Court could say that, I don't know.
But in Georgia, because Georgia is now at about 40+% people of color, if racial gerrymandering happens, we can actually block it in the courts, but not if we don't actually get counted. So the first is we have to have an accurate census. But the second is that, unfortunately, because Georgia does not allow for citizens initiatives, we can't get the legislature to pass a independent redistricting. What we can do, though, is flip 16 seats in the House. Folks think that may be too much, but I'll tell you this, in 2018, we flipped 16 seats. We can do it again. We have enough seats that are leaning Democratic that if we invest and do the work, we can win. And we know it's possible because we saw record turnout in the primary just this week. And the way it looks, Democrats outperformed Republicans for the first time in my recent memory. That is a signal that we have the possibility of winning.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes left to this program. I'm going to ask the last 3 questions, and they're all about Georgia, so you can do the answers together. So okay. Carl M. first says, based on what took place on June 9th in Georgia, how can we have a legitimate and honest election process in Georgia in November? Sarah W. asks, I'd like to know how much work that Fair Fight does in Georgia versus the rest of the country. And Kennedy K. says, my family recently moved to Georgia from New York City, knowing that as a potentially purple state, our vote could really matter. How can we get actively involved in the campaigns to make sure every vote counts in our new home state? And how can our activist friends still in New York City help?
Okay, Fair Fight exists in 2 ways. Fair Fight Action, which is grounded in Georgia, is the entity that filed a lawsuit against the state of Georgia for the poor elections practices, for the unconstitutional election practices in 2018. We continue that work, and we have been able to force some pretty good changes, but the systemic change we need hasn't happened, so we're still in court. We also, on Tuesday, we deployed volunteers across the state. We provided water, we provided masks, we provided chairs, but we also collected stories. We have to remember that one of the reasons Fair Fight was set up, both in Georgia and around the country, the 18 states we're in 2020, we went there in 2019 because we knew the primaries were going to be necessary to collect the data, the stories, and the evidence so we could get the action we needed either from the courts or from the leaders. And so part of what we were able to do in both places is gather information. And we have thousands of stories about what happened in Georgia, which means that as court cases move forward, we can provide declarations, we can explain what happened and use that as proof that change is necessary. We are working, so because it's Georgia, we're doing a lot here. And we've got to understand that Fair Fight, which is based in Georgia, has a much broader portfolio. But Fair Fight 2020 is supporting voter protection teams in every one of our 18 battleground states. And for everyone, if you go to fairfight2020.org, you can learn about those states. You can sign up to help here in Georgia. You can sign up to help anywhere in the country, because we need people. When Wisconsin was being pummeled by those terrible decisions, both in their state legislature and by the Supreme Court, volunteers from around the country manned those hotlines to let Wisconsin voters know that they could still go and vote. And that changed a lot of minds and got people to turn up. And that's one of the reasons they had the successes they had, because we are fighting a fair fight around this country. We need your help. Sign up and volunteer, and we can get it done.
Perfection. Stacey, thank you for participating in this event. The 92nd Street Y is such a fantastic organization. And when they host authors like you, it just makes the members value it and appreciate it that much more. Your book is outstanding. It is a book of hope. It's also a roadmap of things that we need to do. I really hope everyone reads it. And I'm just going to read the closing paragraph of your afterword, which I thought was very good. America once stood as the world's defender, as an exemplar of the competency of democratically led governments. Now is the time to reclaim our world, standing by, restoring our democracy to its full operating force, and re-entering the global arena as a true leader of nations. We cannot afford to wait. Fantastic book. Everyone, please buy it. Support Stacey's amazing, beautiful advocacy. And thank you, Stacey, for doing everything you've done to secure our important constitutional right to vote and making sure every vote counts. Thank you for everything you've done, and I look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Thank you for doing this, and have a wonderful day. To everyone, stay safe, and thank you.
God bless. Take care.
Take care.